It's good to be back. I am Lindsay Bates. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the mother no longer of 3 cats, but of 4. Because on Monday morning this past week, one of the feral cats that has been working very hard these past 5 years at taming my husband convinced Scott to open the slider from our back deck into our back pantry room, and the cat named Buddy decided that this was an invitation he was not going to turn down, and Buddy is now in our laundry room sharing sniffs under the door with our trio and trying to figure out how he's going to take over this new territory. When the universal feline distribution system speaks, there is no arguing with it. I bring you 2 readings this morning, the first from the poet Robert Frost. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street. But not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. And a piece by the Reverend David O. Rankin, Thoughts Following a Suicide. A religion that promises a life without tension, life without conflict, life without suffering is a religion of passivity, a religion of mediocrity, a religion of insignificance. Besides, everything worth doing in the world is a desperate gamble, a game of chance where nothing is certain. What is love? Is it not a wild and sublime speculation which can end in ecstasy or despair? What is courage? Is it not a hazardous risk of fortune which can end in victory or in defeat? What is adventure? Is it not a blind leap in the dark which can end in joy or disaster? What is faith? Is it not a prayerful flip of the coin which can end in heaven or hell? If I refuse to play the game, if I refuse to risk myself, if I refuse to throw the dice, I am never really alive. I am then only flesh, baking in the sun on a middling plateau with no view of the valley and no road to the peak. It is good to be back here, and it feels very different, and it feels very much the same. I do indeed feel taller. And I thank Reverend Scott for being so gracious as to invite repeatedly until I finally gave in. I love retirement. I miss the people with whom I was privileged to work for all those years. But I admit I don't miss the work of writing a sermon every week. The words of the Reverend David Rankin, I am then only flesh, baking in the sun on a middling plateau with no view of the valley and no road to the peak. We are approaching the vernal equinox, finally. In our Northern Hemisphere home, the time of spring's return, the balancing of light and dark, the reappearance of the dying and rising gods of humankind's many mythologies. It is a time for stories, stories that carry many layers of meaning. It is a time especially for stories of resurrection, of life returning despite the reality of the darkness and the death. The ancient story of Persephone is certainly a resurrection myth, but before you can get to the resurrection part of any of these stories, you've got to pass through Lent. You've got to get through the Passion. You've got to give up your life before it can be returned to you. You've got to encounter winter's darkness in the soul before you can welcome the returning lights of spring. So this morning, I'd like to tell you one of my favorite old stories, the old story of the goddess, not so much for its resurrection theme as for its Lenten message, as Persephone and her mother Demeter go in their different ways into the shadows. Now, there are several versions of the Persephone story. The one with which most people are familiar, the one we learned if we studied ancient Greek mythology, comes from the Homeric hymn to Demeter from the 7th century before the Common Era. Demeter, the goddess of the earth and especially of its plant life, was the daughter of Rhea, the ancient pre-Olympian goddess, and she was thus also sister to Zeus, who you may recall had a decidedly non-monogamous understanding of marriage and was constantly seeking entertainment with attractive females of just about any and all species, mortal and divine. Unbothered by incest taboos, Zeus fathered his sister Demeter's daughter Persephone, a child who grew into a young woman of incredible beauty. Hades, god of the underworld and brother to both Demeter and Zeus, became aware of the powerful light of his niece's beauty and decided she would make a pretty terrific queen of the dark realms, brighten the place up a little bit. He knew of Demeter's deep devotion to her daughter. In fact, Demeter never let Persephone out of her sight, which might have been devotion or might have been her intimate knowledge of the level of immorality practiced by members of her clan. Anyway, Hades knew that his odds of getting Sister Demeter to agree to a marriage between himself and Persephone were somewhere between slim and none, so he did the only other honorable thing he could think of. He went to his big brother Zeus and asked for help abducting Persephone. Zeus, seeing great potential for amusement and thinking that his brother Hades wasn't all that bad a guy after all, obliged. He planted a flower of such fragrance and beauty that its petals held all the scents and colors of the created world. Its roots gripped the roof of the underworld, and Hades stationed himself right below this flower in his chariot drawn by 6 black horses and waited. And he didn't have to wait very long. Persephone was out dancing in the fields with her cousins, the daughters of Poseidon of the boundless oceans. And for once, Demeter was not watching her closely. Persephone, for a moment unseen by any of her family, saw and reached for that one special flower planted just for her by her own father. The trap was sprung. The roof of the underworld cracked open, and Hades dashed out in his chariot, scooped up the girl, and disappeared back beneath the earth, which closed tightly behind them before anyone on earth had any idea what was happening. Demeter realized that Persephone was not with her cousins any longer and began searching for her daughter. For 9 days, she searched the earth, taking no food or drink for herself. On the 10th day, the ancient Hecate, dark keeper of the gates between the worlds, took pity and went to Demeter to tell her that while she had not seen the abduction, she had heard Persephone's cries for help and she knew who would know what had happened. Together, the two goddesses went to Helios, the sun, who sees all that happens in the heavens and on the earth. Helios knows all, sees all, tells all. Helios couldn't keep a secret if all of heaven, hell, and the world in between depended upon it. So he filled Demeter in on all the details of her brother's treachery. Furious, Demeter stormed to Olympus and demanded that Zeus force Hades to return Persephone to her mother at once. Zeus tried to calm her down. Hades was a pretty good catch for a young goddess, after all, and queen of the realm of the dead was a pretty impressive title, and couldn't Demeter just be a little bit happy for her daughter's good fortune? Demeter was not buying it. She sank into a grief-stricken depression and stopped attending to the needs of the earth. Unable to go to Hades herself, unable to send anyone, she refused to do anything but mourn her lost child. No seeds sprouted. No plants grew. The green earth turned barren and bare. The mortals offered sacrifice and prayer, but the goddess was indifferent. Her suffering, as far as she was concerned, was far greater than theirs, and it seemed almost certain that all humankind would die. Without the human community, of course, there would be no sacrifices to any of the gods. Without people to worship them, the gods themselves would cease to exist. The Olympians therefore sent Iris to beg Demeter to lift her curse and restore life to the dying earth. Demeter refused. Deep winter set in. The waters became solid. The earth was smothered in thick snows. And the gods, not particularly concerned about the mortal inhabitants of earth, but very concerned about their own immortal futures, next sent their messenger Hermes down into the underworld to beg Hades to let Persephone go. Hades was sympathetic to the concerns of his fellow gods, and he too, of course, needed a steady flow of mortals to keep his own kingdom going. But he did not want to give up Persephone. After some thought, he persuaded Persephone to eat some pieces of a pomegranate, the food of the underworld. And when she did so, she was bound to Hades' realm for as many months of the year as there had been pomegranate seeds that she had eaten. She could leave the underworld, but she would have to return for a portion of every year. So Persephone returned to the surface of the earth, guided by Hermes and Hecate, to her waiting mother. Demeter, in her rejoicing, brought forth the world's first springtime. The snows melted, the seeds sprouted, new life appeared at the bidding of the goddess. But Persephone had consumed those pomegranate seeds, 3 or 4 or 6, depending upon who's telling the story. So every year at the end of the summer, Persephone returns to the underworld. And Demeter, who has never managed to overcome her separation anxieties, every fall ceases to care for the earth and takes all mortal life with her into mourning until Persephone emerges from the underworld and spring once more returns. And that is the generally accepted version of the affair. But we need to do a little bit of backtracking. In the story, as I've told it, Persephone is pretty much a non-presence. She is a passive bit of decoration being fought over by a lust-filled god and a frankly overly possessive goddess from an Olympian family that gives whole new levels of meaning to the word dysfunctional. But a number of feminist scholars and revisionists, among them Charlene Spretnik and Clarissa Pinkola Estes, have suggested that Homer's version of this story is a reflection of the culture in which Homer, whoever he or she or they may have been, was writing, a culture that was most emphatically patriarchal. Spretnak and Estes offer Persephone a rather more active role, which they argue would have been true to the goddess-oriented culture from which it is suggested this story originally rose. In this version, Persephone is not handed off to her uncle by an abusive father. Instead, Persephone, a child goddess, out playing in a field, hears through a crack in the earth, through the roof of the underworld, the cries of the dead. And she's curious. Her mother has never told her about death or suffering or fear. And finding an opening from the surface of the earth to the realms below, Persephone enters the underworld to learn about the realm of darkness. She might or might not have encountered Hades. He may have been a later addition to the story, or they may have met as equals. But there she is in the underworld, and Persephone takes on the role as queen of the underworld. Strong, protective, every bit as powerful as Hades, caring for her people. And this Persephone is described in bits and pieces in other classical Greek writing. That fierce Persephone, queen of the underworld, who also shows up in Homer's work, is no passive innocent. She's no victim of anyone. She's a powerful young woman who matures, who grows acquainted with the darkness, an image that I think validates the Spretnak-Estes thesis. And what's important about this Persephone is that she enters the realm of the shadows of her own free will. And in that decision, and in the learnings that follow, she changes from the innocent, immature maiden to the mature woman who offers caring, support, and sacrifice, not because she has been trapped, not because she's been forced into it, but because her help is needed, and offering that help is her own free choice. And it's only after she has made her deliberate journey through the shadows, learning the lessons of the darkness, that she's ready to walk again in the light. Only when she truly knows the meaning hidden within the darkness is she ready for a renewed commitment to life beneath the all-seeing gaze of the sun. Demeter also grows in this version of the story. Again, she halts the growth of all plants upon the earth while her daughter is away from her. But this time, although her sorrow is still real, the motive is not anger or vengeance. Demeter, like Persephone, also learns something from the realm of the shadows. The seasons of fall and winter are the times when all the world follows Persephone into the interior world, going within, facing the deep places of the soul. The inactivity of the outer world has to stop us for a time, so the soul can put itself back into balance, allowing itself to be aware of the dimensions, the contradictions, the polarities of being. The journeys are seldom journeys that we want to take, but we do not outgrow our childishness without them. They are as necessary to the growth of the soul as winter's resting time is to the fertility of the earth and the grain that grows upon it. The perpetual summer of Persephone's pre-Hades existence has no depth, no power, no real meaning. It is the knowledge, the experience of the shadow that gives the experiences of compassion, of connection, the knowledge of death. The Homeric Persephone and Demeter are unthinking advocates of all or nothing. There's not much ambiguity in that version of the myth. Persephone as victim remains a child, dependent, careless, kept frozen, ironically enough, in the perpetual summertime of Demeter's vigilant protection. When Persephone is upon the earth, all is well. When she is not, all is dying or dead. Demeter herself exists only in extremes. There is only joy, or there is only sorrow. And life isn't like that. The older version of the myth, in which Persephone makes her own choice to go into the darkness, to go within, strikes me as far more truthful, far more faithful to the swings and changes and mixtures of light and darkness, joy and sadness, pleasure and pain, relatedness and loneliness, and all the other mixtures that are fundamental elements of life. And interestingly, and not entirely parenthetically, the Christian church stole this idea from Persephone. The first tellings of the story of Persephone and Demeter knew the spiritual truth that Persephone's journey revealed. And there is a line, some of you may remember from the traditional creeds, that today is translated, "He descended into hell." That was added sometime in the 3rd or 4th century when the early Christian church was trying to account for the missing time between the death of Jesus on Good Friday and his resurrection on Easter morning. The early church was very worried about where he was and what he was doing. Sort of like Demeter. And the early church came to a thoroughly Persephonian conclusion. The Latin versions of the oldest texts do not say descendit ad infernum, which would mean he descended into hell. They say descensus ad inferos, which means he was going within. His spirit took Persephone's journey into the realm of the shadows. Twice a year, at the times of the vernal and the autumnal equinox, day and night, light and darkness are perceived as having achieved balance. But the perfect balance does not and cannot last. We go back and forth, without and within, sometimes more in the darkness, sometimes more in the light, in cycles as necessary as the changes of the seasons, as the earth approaches and moves back away from the sun, as we perceive it in our small place upon this planet. But it is in the darkness of the earth that seeds generate. It is in the darkness of the womb that human life begins, in the dark and quiet places of the human heart and soul that compassion and empathy, spiritual growth and mature love and power have their deepest roots. And they need that darkness. They do not take root, take form, or take life without it. And then it is in the returning light of springtime, springtime of earth and springtime of spirit, that the fruits of the deep darkness burst forth to dance once again in the light. Amen.
Visit us at UUSG.org.